Is there an area in your life that causes nagging unhappiness because of something you wish you had that you don't have? A better body, stable finances, a relationship you long for. You're mostly happy in life, but whenever you think about that one thing, that one part of your life, you just churn on the inside. You wish things were different, and it's the kind of wishing that hurts. You can't be happy without that thing you're longing for. This is one of the most common forms of anxiety. It's the inner turmoil that comes from craving something you don't have. The biblical term for that feeling is greed. And you might hear that and right away think, greed, I'm not greedy. I don't have a problem with greed. I'm not trying to get rich. I don't care about money or whatever. Don't think of greed only in financial terms. You can be greedy for anything in the world. Any desire that stirs up the bad kind of anxiety when it goes unfulfilled is greed. Now, not all strong desires are greed. Strong desires are healthy. It's good to have them. Jesus had them. Luke 22:15, he strongly desired things. Greed has nothing to do with the intensity of your desire. Nor is greed about how much you want. You can desire $1 million and not have any greed in your heart. Or you could be greedy for $5. It's not about what you want. It's not about how much you want. It's about what happens in your heart when you don't get what you want. Does that desire cause the bad kind of anxiety when it goes unfulfilled? That's the question when you're examining whether something is greed. You ever wondered why you are at peace with certain unfulfilled desires in your life, but other unfulfilled desires tear you up on the inside? The ones that tear you up, cause anxiety, are the ones your soul thinks you have to have in order to be happy. That's why it tears you up. There's lots of desires I have. There's plenty of things I would like. I would love to have a cabin up in the mountains. But I don't need that for a happy life. So when that desire goes unfulfilled, it causes me zero anxiety. None at all. Even though my desire for a cabin in the mountains is actually a pretty strong desire. I would really like to have one. On the other hand, though, if you want something and your happiness is riding on that desire, anxiety is going to boil, even if it's a desire for something small, like a dishwasher that doesn't leave bits of food on your bowls, or a word of approval from someone, or an apology from someone who hurt you. Being deprived of $1 million mansion somewhere doesn't bother you at all, but lack of cabinet space driving you crazy. Why is that? Because your desire for the mansion isn't a greedy one, and your desire for the cabinets is. It's all about what you think you need in order to be happy. Greed is an attitude that attaches itself to a desire, and it's the attitude that says, I not only want this thing, I have to have this thing. I've got to have it. And the reason greedy desires cause anxiety is because your happiness is on the line. There's nothing your soul fears more than unhappiness. That's like the worst fate there is. You can handle any deprivation as long as your happiness stays intact, right? As long as you're happy, you can handle anything. But if your joy is threatened, that places your soul on high alert. Like, maybe I'm not going to be able to be happy. Anxiety. It activates the anxiety response because there's no greater threat to your well-being than an unhappy life. So what's the solution to this kind of anxiety? Well, Paul gives a solution in Philippians 4, verses 10 to 13. And this is very personal for Paul because he had a history with this. He had a history of this kind of anxiety. In Romans 7:8, he describes a time when his heart was consumed with every greedy desire. Every greedy desire. He says covetous and greed are the exact same thing, just synonyms. By the time Paul wrote Philippians 4, though, the peace of God that transcends understanding had driven that kind of anxiety out, and he didn't have that greed anymore. Listen to what he says. Philippians 4, I'll read from verse 11. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content. Actually, I'll back up to verse 10, because in verse 10, he gives the occasion for why he's saying this. He says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me, speaking of their financial gifts they sent. He says, but I'm not saying that because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content. There's the peace of God right there. Content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. So we've been studying all about how to have the peace of God in times of anxiety in the first part of Philippians 4. Right? That's what it's been about this whole time. Now, this next section, starting in verse 10, is all about contentment. And the thing that we need to understand is he has not changed the subject. Okay, it's the same topic. He's still talking about the peace of God calming his anxiety. This paragraph in verses 10 to 13, shows us what that internal peace of God looks like specifically in the context of earthly treasures, like money. There's a certain kind of anxiety that comes from greedy desires. And when the peace of God calms that kind of anxiety, the peace of God is called contentment. A lot of people misunderstand what contentment is. They think being content means not wanting anything more than what you have. Sometimes people will define it that way. That is not what contentment means. Because, that would be tough if that were contentment, because you would never be allowed to want anything you don't already have. What would you do? You just sit on the couch all day. I go to work every single day because I want money that I don't currently have, right? We need to desire things we don't have. That's kind of good ambition and drive powers us through life. That's good. It's good to have strong desires. You're not guilty of discontent just because you have a really strong desire for something you don't have. That's fine. Strong desires are fine. We need that. Contentment isn't the lack of desire. It's the lack of greedy desire. The word translated content here in Philippians 4 is an interesting word. It's not the same word translated content in other places that talk about contentment in the Bible. Here, it's the word that means independent. Contentment is when your happiness is not dependent on circumstances. Even in times of unfulfilled desires, you don't lose your peace. You really want something? Oh, I want this thing so bad, but I don't get it. I'm still okay. I'm still happy without it. There's a great book by Jeremiah Burroughs titled The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, written 400 years ago. I don't think anybody's improved on it in 400 years. It's the best book on contentment that I know of. You can get it free online. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. In that book, here's how he defines contentment. He says, and this is really good, he says, contentment is that sweet, inward, quiet, gracious frame of spirit which freely submits to and delights in God's wise and fatherly disposal in every condition. So Christian contentment is that sweet, inward, quiet, gracious frame of spirit which freely submits to and delights in God's wise and fatherly disposal in every condition. Disposal in the 1600s meant arrangement, the way God arranges circumstances. Contentment is when your spirit is calm because you submit to and delight in the way God runs things. In other words, you love providence. You love providence. You love the way God runs the world. You love what God does and the way he runs the world, even when it hurts. That's contentment. Most people think they'll be content once they get that next thing that they're wanting. I just need this one thing, one more, then I'll be content. If I just get this one more level, then I'll be content. Would you? The writer of Ecclesiastes was rich enough to test that theory. He tried taking every earthly treasure and pleasure to the extreme to see if it would make him happy. Money, recreation, work, projects, sex, power. One by one, he proved that no amount of any of those would satisfy, no matter how much he got. Thing is, most of us don't have the finances to try that experiment. We never can learn that because we can't do what he did because we don't have the money to do it. And so we live under this delusion that contentment is just over the next rise. Just when I just get that next thing. And we don't see ourselves as greedy because I don't need a ton more. I just need that one more. That little bit more. And then I'll be happy. But it never happens. When we say that we're like John Rockefeller, he was the richest man in the world in his time, and somebody asked him how much money is enough, and his answer was just a little bit more. And we're no different from that. The fact is, rich people struggle with contentment just as much as poor people, because contentment has nothing to do with how much you have. Nothing. It's about greed. And greed is a problem for rich people as well as poor people. And if you question that, just look at us. I mean, we live in the wealthiest culture in history. We eat like kings. We have creature comforts and luxuries beyond what most people who have ever lived could even dream of. But has that erased problems like complaining or self-pity or anger over what we don't have? Not even close. No. Wealth does not eliminate greed because the more earthly treasures we get, the more prone we are to fall in love with them. So contentment is hard for rich people. Notice what Paul says here. Have you ever noticed in verse 11 through 12, Paul had to learn how to be content with a little, and he had to learn how to be content with a lot? You ever think about that? Have you learned the secret of being content with a lot? I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He didn't just have to learn the secret of contentment in times of poverty and deprivation. He also had to learn contentment in times of plenty. That word translated plenty there, it's just a normal Greek word for rich. It's normally translated rich. Paul had to learn the secret of being content when he was rich. Because greed is such a temptation for rich people. But he also had to learn the secret of being content in times of poverty because greed is a temptation when you're poor. A lot of times rich people are accused of being greedy. That's like synonymous. It's like rich, greedy rich people. Greedy rich this, greedy. And the people who complain about the greedy rich people are very often poor people who are greedy for the rich people's money, right? Everyone struggles with this. So when Paul speaks of the extremes, poverty and riches, it's a merism, which means two extremes and everything in between. That's a merism. He could have contentment at every income level because contentment is unrelated to circumstances. It's independent of circumstances, nothing to do with how much you have. I think Paul might have been reading the book of Habakkuk when he wrote Philippians 4. Really the whole book of Philippians. Habakkuk 3:17 and 18 says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. That sounds like Philippians. Rejoice in the Lord. I'll say it again, rejoice, right? That's what the whole theme is. When your joy is in the Lord, you can lose everything in this world, which is what he describes here. And it won't cause you anxiety. So think for a second about how valuable this virtue of contentment is. How priceless is contentment? Without contentment, life is constant anxiety, no matter what. Always longing, never happy, chasing after the treasures of this world to make you happy. Living that way, chasing after this world's treasures to be happy, that's like feeding the bears in Yellowstone Park. If you give a bear your bologna sandwich in the park, he doesn't just go skipping off into the woods thanking God for the blessing, right? What does he do? He devours it, and then he comes back and kills the next tourist who won't give him a bologna sandwich. Feeding the bears makes life dangerous for other people in the park because the more you feed them, the less satisfied they are. And our souls are just like that. They're just like that. Proverbs 13:16 compares the greedy heart to fire, which is never satisfied. Right? You can't put out a fire by throwing more sticks on it. They only increase the fire's appetite. A single flame will devour an entire forest if you keep feeding it. You can't satisfy discontent by going on more vacations or getting a promotion or winning the lottery. The more you feed it, the worse it gets. Discontent locks you into perpetual poverty. Even if your bank account is loaded, you're poor. You may have heard that saying, contentment makes poor men rich, and discontent makes rich men poor. That's true. That's really close to what Paul said in 1 Timothy 6:6, where he says, godliness with contentment is great gain. Speaking about money in that context. Content people are the richest people in the world financially because they're the only ones in the world who have enough money to be happy. Right? If you had $10 million and you're not happy with it, what good is it? You still don't have enough money to be happy, so you are poor. If you lack contentment, no amount of blessing from God will give you peace. No amount of blessing from God will give you peace. No amount of money, no amount of favorable circumstances, no amount of anything can lift you out of the poverty of your perspective if you have discontent. Discontent makes you unhappy no matter how much you have. Contentment makes you happy no matter what you have. If you learn this secret that Paul talks about here, it would make you happier than tripling your income. People who learn this secret are perpetually rich, richer than John Rockefeller was because he didn't have enough. And content people have enough. What could be more valuable than contentment? So, how do you get it? How did Paul go from being this consuming greed that he had back in Romans 7 to this sweet, peaceful contentment that he enjoyed in Philippians 4? Well, it wasn't easy. It was a secret he had to learn. Verse 12, I have learned the secret of being content. And then even after learning it, it still didn't come easy. It required supernatural strengthening from the Lord for him to pull it off. Look what he says right after he talks about how he can be content in every situation. He gives the reason. He says, I can do that because I can do everything through him who gives me strength. People take that verse out of context. It's not talking about dunking a basketball or winning sports or acing a test or becoming president or any of that. It's talking about the ability to be content with a lot or with a little. Contentment requires supernatural strengthening, enablement from God. And it's interesting here when he says, through him who gives me strength, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. The word strength, this is the word for strength that's normally used in a context of being empowered to withstand an attack. The picture is greed is coming at you like an armed combatant. It's attacking you. And you need to be strengthened to resist. Or to use the imagery from the parable of the soils, the deceitfulness of wealth and the desires for other things, which is discontent, will create an anxiety that Jesus said will choke the work of the Scripture right out of your heart like weeds choking out plants, struggling sprout. Your very spiritual life is threatened by greed and discontent. And surviving that attack requires supernatural strengthening because it requires letting go of your idea of what would make you happy. And letting go of your idea of what would make you happy in life can be excruciating. Because you just know, this thing would make me happy. And so letting go of that is hard. So what is the secret of contentment? He gives us two clues here. First, he begins this paragraph on contentment with these words. Verse 10, I rejoice greatly in what? The Lord. I rejoice in the Lord. Now, there's no surprise there. Rejoicing in the Lord is the theme of the whole book of Philippians. And it makes sense that it's also the key to contentment, rejoicing in the Lord. Because discontent comes from greed, right? Which is rejoicing in the world's unreliable treasures, which come and go. Rejoicing in the Lord produces contentment because the Lord is always there. He's always available. The only way to be content in every situation is to rejoice in something unrelated to the situations, right? And God is the only one who fits that description. He's the only one who's there no matter what the situation. Now, does this mean you're indifferent to money or other earthly treasures? You just don't care about them? No. Remember, he says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. He's talking about their financial gift, the money he sent. This whole thing, this whole section on contentment starts with him saying, I'm really happy about getting this money. That's what kicked the whole thing off. He was super happy about getting the money, but notice, he didn't rejoice in the money. He rejoiced in the Lord because of the money. Very important distinction. He rejoiced in the Lord because of the money. Paul rejoiced in God because of what the Philippians did, namely, show concern for him. They showed him concern by sending him this gift. Now, everybody likes it when somebody shows concern, sends them a gift. But Paul, the difference with Paul is he saw their concern and their love as coming from the Lord. He was thankful to the Philippians also, no doubt about that, but he was mostly thankful to God who worked in the Philippians to will and to act to be generous to him. So when Paul saw all that money, he didn't see this money and say, great, now I can have some food after not eating the last couple days, I'll be better off. Instead of that, it was, look, God is saying I love you again to me. And this time he's doing it through the Philippians. Most people don't rejoice in the Lord much because they don't see their blessings as coming from the Lord. When people are involved, they just see the people. To rejoice in the Lord requires a lot of theological thought, giving thought to your blessings. You got to process them. One thing that stands out when you read the Psalms is how much time the psalmist spent processing their blessings. You ever notice that? It's not uncommon for people who have suffered a big loss to say, oh man, I need time to process this. I got to work. I need some time in prayer. I got to go for a long walk or a drive. I got to talk to a friend. When the jolt of really bad news hits, it takes some time to work through it, to just kind of come to grips with, this is my new reality, right? And so we need to process our suffering. And that's fine. Psalmists did that too. They processed their suffering, but they also did the same thing with their blessings. They took time to, when some delightful, wonderful thing happened to them, they would pray about it and write about it and contemplate it and sort through it in their minds and give it theological categories. They process their blessings. Think of how it would change your life if you did that. More. You get an amazing job offer, an unexpected financial windfall, or somebody is kind to you, or some family thing works out well, and you say, okay, I need to get alone and take some time to process this blessing. And you give it some serious thought to what God is doing and what's the meaning behind this blessing. You consider, okay, I need to give some thought. How am I going to be content in this new wonderful situation that God has blessed? How can I have joy in the Lord instead of in this blessing? For Paul to rejoice in the Lord for what the Philippians did required some heavy theological reflection. He had to remind himself where the blessings came from. That's not obvious. You can't see it with your eyes. It takes intentional, concerted effort to rejoice in the Lord and in His love and rejoice in the attention He's giving you when you receive good things in the world. So that's the first clue. He rejoiced in the Lord. That's one path to contentment. Rejoice in the Lord. That's the first clue. The second one is in verse 12, where Paul repeats the merism of poverty and riches 3 times. Okay, I can be content. This, tons of stuff and nothing. But notice, when he describes being rich, being poor, being rich, being poor, being rich, The first time he describes being poor, look at the words he uses. I'll quote it from the ESV because this is a literal translation of this verse. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. So he doesn't just say, I know how to be poor. He says, I know how to be brought low by my poverty. That word, brought low, is the same word used in Philippians 2:8, back in chapter 2, of Jesus self-humbling, where it says Jesus humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. Same word. It's talking about humbling yourself, being brought low. So what Paul's saying here is, you learn contentment when you allow poverty and deprivation and hardship to humble you, to bring you low, just like Jesus brought himself low. And that brings us to the next miracle cure for anxiety, which is humility. And we'll cover that in the next session. Okay, godliness training exercises for session 14. And again, I urge you to do these exercises. I really don't think these principles are going to help very much or stick if you don't do these exercises. You think back to like sessions 1, 2, 3, probably don't even remember what the principles were that would have been helpful for you. Just hearing them isn't going to change your life. You need to put these into practice, and that's what these exercises are designed for. So I've got 4 of them for this session. Number 1, this chapter, this session began with questions about whether you have areas of discontent in your life. Use those questions that I asked at the beginning to uncover any pockets of greed in your life. So just ask yourself those questions. Is there some area in my life where there's this nagging, painful longing of discontent, where I can't be happy? Every time I think about this thing, it causes anxiety, and I long for it with a kind of longing that hurts, and it's causing stress. Those kinds of questions. Use those questions to discover if you have areas of discontent, pockets of greed. The 3 symptoms of discontent to watch for are complaining, self-pity, or anger over what you don't have. If you have any of those 3, then that's a sign of greed. So when you find these areas of greed in your heart, these pockets of greed, jot them down and give some thought to how you could shift to rejoicing in the Lord in those areas. Okay, number 2, take some time to process some recent blessings in your life. So look past the people, past the circumstances, past the things you can see with your eyes. Look at God and think through what He was doing, what it meant that He gave you that blessing, and really process it and think it through. The God who moved in the hearts of people who did something to benefit you. Consider the meaning of what God did. Write down your conclusions and then talk them over with a friend or family member or something. Just process it. Number 3, in Luke 3:14, John told the soldiers to be content with their pay. He said there's a lot of different ways you can be content, but for the soldiers, they needed to be told, be content with your pay. If John was preaching to you and he knew your heart, what do you think he would have told you to be content with? Give that some thought. And then number 4, keep reviewing the verses that you've memorized and then add Philippians 4, 12, and 13, these verses that we've looked at tonight.
The plant dies on him.
Yeah. There's a whole chapter in the book of Jonah about discontent, and it's one of the funniest chapters in the Bible, I think. It's comical to me, that chapter about the plant, because you got all these big theological things happening in Job. This prophet of God, he's sent to this big nation and this big city, and he runs away, and then they get the whale, and this amazing stuff happens. And then you got and it's only 4 chapters, and then you got this whole chapter about a plant. And Jonah is hilarious, like the most emotional prophet ever. He gets so upset about this plant. I mean, this plant dies and he wants to die. And God says, does that make any sense that you want to die because a plant died? And Jonah says, yes! And he makes an argument for why it's reasonable that he would want to die because he lost his plant. And, you can understand, you've ever been really hot in the desert, and you get some shade, and then you lose the shade. I guess it's a bummer, but then God takes the occasion to make an example. He says, you know how much you love that plant? Well, I have an idea how much I love this entire city of thousands of people. And so, if you can love a plant that much, can I love people that much, Jonah? So it's a poignant lesson, but it's also a comical illustration of our sins is sometimes what we need, so we can see the folly of them. Because, you say, I would never get that worked up about a plant dying, but it's not that much different than what we get worked up over. It's just we get really attached to something and we lose it and we're all upset, right? Yeah, the whole time he had the plant, if he would have been rejoicing in the Lord and then he loses the plant, what would he still have? The Lord, right? Yeah. So if your joy stops when your blessing stops, then that's a good indication. Okay, I wasn't rejoicing in the Lord, I was rejoicing in the thing. Okay, great question. So what about your anxiety that you have over lacking some spiritual virtue, or your walk with the Lord not being what it needs to be? One thing I said, and I know it went by really fast, and I maybe should have made more of it, is discontent is when you have an unfulfilled desire that causes the bad kind of anxiety. The bad kind. If I have an unfulfilled desire for spiritual things and it creates the good kind of anxiety, that's not discontent, it's not greed. It's good. What's the good kind of anxiety? Anxiety that motivates you to do what you need to do, to take action that you need to take. The bad kind of anxiety is anxiety about something that you have no control over. You need to just let go. So no, I don't think you're guilty of discontent if you're just saying, Lord, I'm not content with where I am spiritually. I need more. I got to have more. As a deer pants for streams of water, my soul is panting for more. When can I go to meet with God? That kind of thing that is good anxiety. That's what anxiety is supposed to do. Drive us to take action, to do things that we need to take action to do.
Without trying to tell you you're not good enough.
Yeah, that's a great point. So now I have the good anxiety. I'm really motivated to grow spiritually. What's the enemy going to do? Well, he's like a master of judo, right? In judo, you use the opponent's momentum to make him fall. And so he takes my momentum is towards trying to be spiritual. He's not going to try to convince me to be unspiritual. He's going to try to use that momentum to hurt me. And so what the enemy will do is try to get me to give up because I'm having so little success. He'll try to push me into self-condemnation. And those aren't the fruit of good anxiety. Those are the enemy, the accuser of the brethren. And so he'll try to say, I'm saying, okay, I've got to have more passion. I want to have more love for God. And Satan comes to see you don't, and so you're worthless, and you're 46 years old, you still don't barely love him at all, and so you might as well give up. And of course, none of that is biblical. So we need to be careful with our zeal for spiritual things, not to let them twist down into self-condemnation or discouragement or anything like that, because there's a principle of waiting on the Lord. And if I'm trying to learn some spiritual virtue and it's taking a long time, I'm not the one that sets the timetable. I need to let God set that.
Something I have to really think on now.
Yeah. Yeah, when you have really severe suffering, you have a clear path and a clear objective, a clear enemy. Everything's real clear what needs to happen. I want to try to save my life, here, survive. And so little things, things like your hair and stuff, that compared to your life, just they don't matter. And And now you have to adjust your whole set of things that matter in your life. Kind of like,
Odd.
it is. You know, it's like if you, for someone in our culture, finding out that your insurance got canceled, your health insurance got canceled, and now you have to go through the whole hassle of finding another health insurance company and, you know, whatever, and it's going to take up tons of time, and it's going to be more expensive, and it's a big headache. Well, somebody in, you know, Ethiopia somewhere who's, their big headache is, I got to scrounge up enough food so my kids don't starve today. And it's like two totally different kinds of things. But if the guy from Ethiopia goes from that and gets, you know, he comes to the United States and he gets an education, he gets a job, and he gets into the middle class, then for him, you know, the insurance thing's a real hardship. And so, but that adjustment in between is where you are right now, where you're having this whole world of changes. So, yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that that's that you're finding that hard. It makes sense that that would be hard.
Well, and it's a whole different type of anxiety that I've never really dealt with before.
Yeah.
It's different.
It's why the Bible is this thick. You know, sometimes you wonder, why doesn't he just say trust God? You know, trust God. Well, there are so many different kinds of trust and so many different enemies to trust that attack your trust. So many different angles to consider it from, that what's really amazing is he jammed it all into this small of a space. But you're right, it's...
Position to be in
yeah,
right now.
yeah.
I really can't.
Well, you've been given life, and you've been given greater health than you had, and so the question is, okay, God, you gave me this gift. What do you want me to do with it? You know,
And I don't know what he wants to do with me. Why didn't he just kill me? You know.
well, he didn't. He's not ready for that. He wants to do something with you. He wants to do something important with you, and you know, you don't need to know exactly what to do. You only need to know. You only need to find a righteous path.
Yeah.
This is the thing that I've been learning about God's will, is if you're trying to find that one thing you're supposed to do, that's not the concern of Scripture. The concern of Scripture is take a godly path. God gives us freedom to choose among numerous godly paths because he wants us to be like him. He wants us to be creative. And so you get to pick. And any godly path you pick is fine. You don't have to worry about picking the wrong one. Just pick one that is a righteous path. And if it's the one you want, then you'll be following God's guidance, and it'll be fulfilling, and it'll be important.
What it was.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's kind of like when you were dying of cancer, you had to learn the secret of being content with a little. And now you're having to learn the secret of being content with a lot. And those are two different lessons, and they're both hard to learn.
It is.
And Paul was the same way. He says, sometimes I was poor, and I had to learn how to do that. And then I got rich, and I had to start over in kindergarten and learn how to do that, you know. So
I